So I will start talking, and even though I can't hear anything, even myself, anyway, let's start. Good evening, Miriam Brahma. It's good to see so many of you again, just a week after our first outing for Neil Rees's fascinating talk about pre-war, Second World War, Durrës or Durazzo. We have apologized for the glitch which then occurred. And I must now say how grateful we are to see Neil Rees again and for his agreeing to repeat his talk. I've never heard of this anywhere in any forum. I think this is a most remarkable gesture, Neil. We will always remember it. In advance of the talk, let me also thank again Patricia Swire, our honorary secretary, and our two board members, Saida Labuti, based here in London, and Carolyn Perry, based in Albania, who will be facilitating our event. In advance of the talk, I should tell you that we are expecting to record it. This is important in that this talk about Durrës and the British Legation there is another contribution of the Anglo-Albanian Association to the current centenary year, which has been running since the beginning of 2022. The centenary commemorates 100 years of diplomatic relations between Albania and the United Kingdom. Neil joined the Bible Society in 1989 and works with them as an IT consultant. One country which he has focused on as a historian, though, this is very much his after hours involvement, history. One of the countries which he's focused on is Albania. Neil himself lives in the Chilterns, and one of his first books was an account of the exile during World War II of King Zog and Queen Geraldine to Parmore House in the Chilterns. Neil gave us a fascinating talk on the occasion of the launch of his very readable book on this subject. I must now hand over to Neil, who plans to talk for around 45 minutes, followed by questions and answers. And I have to tell you that unfortunately, I cannot stay for the whole of the rest of the evening because of a prior commitment. But I would like to just say that the Q&A will be managed by Patricia, Saida and Carolyn, and they will explain to you how this will function. I suspect it will function via the chat, and I presume everybody knows how to access the chat. If they don't, they should be taught quickly. I should just tell you also that we are planning to hold our annual general meeting on the 28th of September, and paid up members of the AAA will receive joining instructions for this. And the evening will also contain a talk after the AGM about Albania's film industry. That's a talk by Fioralba Miraka, who is also a board member. And just to give you one more element that we are looking forward to is a talk on the 12th of October by Dr. Dimitra Chkitsa. She, by the way, is the fellow at CEAS, the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. And she'll be talking about the effect of industrialization in Albania. And during November, we will celebrate Dita e Flamurit, and we will let you know exactly when and where we will be doing that. So I wish you all an excellent evening, and I'm leaving you in very good hands. Best wishes to you for the evening, and Miru Pashem. I will stay with you for a few minutes, but then I will disappear, I'm afraid. but enjoy your evening. Thank you.
Right. Nice to see you all. And I'm currently not in the Albanian embassy as I was last time, but I'm in my office in my house. And I'm just going to do a share screen and bring up my presentation for you. So if you can all confirm that you can see that, I shall go ahead. Lovely. Right, so I'm going to tell you the story of the British Legation in Albania before the Second World War. There is a picture of the building in Durrës as it looked in the 30s. And where did I get this information from? Well, you know, just quickly, it's from interviews, diaries, memoirs, newspaper articles, and places, visits to the places mentioned. And originally I did it. It was really as background information for the book I wrote on King Zog, which is called Royal Exile. And in that book, you get chapter 2 called The British in Albania. And it's just kind of background to the story of King Zog, but actually it's a whole story in itself, hence the talk. I need to introduce you to the Levant Consular Service, which is our historical background. And I want to explain some terms. And these terms may well be known to many of you. Some may be obvious, some not, but I'm going to go through them anyway. So first of all, in history, an embassy was a diplomatic mission represented by an ambassador, which was historically between monarchs. One king or queen sent an ambassador to another king or queen. And so originally embassies were only between monarchies. So Britain has always had embassies. And then as other countries started developing and they were republics, there would be legations. And it was a diplomatic representation between countries, which historically, not now, but ranked below that of an embassy. And instead of having an ambassador, there was a minister, or they were known as the envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary. Well, obviously just called minister most of the time. After the Second World War, all legations were upgraded to embassies, and it's now one. We don't have this kind of class system that there used to be. A consulate was the office that would issue visas and renew passports and things, and could often be a local office to an embassy or legation, but could also be within the embassy or legation. So some embassies have a consulate office within them, and others might have consulate offices around the country. So in the UK, for example, many countries have an embassy in London, but they might have a consulate in Edinburgh and Cardiff and Birmingham, depending on how large their local population is. And so these are represented by consul. For our purposes, we've also got two words which are relevant to the Levant service, which is a dragoman, who was an interpreter, and a kavas, which was an armed guard. Originally, within the Ottoman Empire, people could be appointed as honorary consuls around the Ottoman Empire, as long as they could speak English. And in 1858, the rule was changed that only British people could serve as consuls, and they would train people from the expatriate community. So you might be a British person living in a city in the Ottoman Empire, and then you might become appointed as a consul. But from 1877, they professionalized the service, and people were trained to be consuls and then sent out to the Ottoman Empire. And many of those people who stayed a long time would end up learning the local languages, Turkish, Armenian, and whatever they were, and then they might become a dragoman, which is an interpreter between other British people and the locals there. The Ottoman Empire was divided into vilayets or provinces. The role of these consulates was to protect British citizens, which were kind of the main role, I suppose, in a way, issue visas to people who wanted to travel to Britain. They could also conduct weddings. So particularly in the Ottoman Empire, which was not everywhere, but it was largely Muslim, people might want to get married and have a Christian ceremony, and a consul or the minister was qualified to do that. It was also an address for post and packages. So if you were traveling around, you might give the address of the consulate or the legation building that you were going to travel to pick your post and package up from. And it was a place of safety in times of trouble, because in times of war, they were not to be attacked, and they were considered the territory of the country that ran it. And to this day, an embassy is considered the sovereign territory of the country that owns it. They were also to encourage trade and collect intelligence and information, especially in times of war, and could also store valuables and provide a banking service. Often a legation would have somebody who was the Chancellor, and he would look after the safe. And if British people were worried about the safety of their goods, they could lodge them at the consulate or the legation. So with all that in mind, I'm actually going to go, before Durrës, we had a consulate at Shkodra. And the vilayet, so the Ottoman Empire vilayet of Shkodra, also known as Scutari, was also known as the vilayet of Albania. And Shkodra was considered the capital of Albania. Now I'm talking about before the independence of Albania. The region of the Ottoman Empire where people spoke Albanian was known as Albania. And Shkodra was considered the regional capital. So there was a British consulate at Shkodra from the early 1800s at least. And at different times, there were also consulates at Durrës and Vlora. But if you read the old books and the newspaper articles, they were always known by their Italian names. So Shkodra was Scutari, Durrës was Durazzo, and Vlora was Valona. So these were what you will see them referred to in the old British books. But anyway, the main British consulate to Albania in the Victorian era was in Shkodra. And the British were not the only people to have a consulate there. There were also, the French had a consulate, the Austrians and the Italians and the Germans also had consulates there at different times. And the street which they were all built in was known as Boulevard Diplomatique, because in the Victorian era, the diplomatic language was French. Here we have a map of the Ottoman Empire, which is dated 1878. And you can see down here, on where we've got Albania, it actually says Illyrians or Albanians. That's not because they weren't sure which they were, it's because they considered them the same, two different ways of saying the same thing. And here, up here, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but there's a dot there for Shkodra. You see there's no dot for Durrës, there's no dot for Tirana, which was a tiny little village then. Shkodra was considered the capital. And if I superimpose the modern borders on there, you can see how the old borders are still very much behind the current borders of countries today. So I did a newspaper trail of members of the British consulate at Shkodra going back to 1820. And I know that the British Embassy in Tirana is celebrating the centenary of diplomatic relations, but I've taken it back over 200 years. I hope that's okay. And this is not in any way comprehensive. They're just the names that I picked up. But we've got a nice number of people. So there was always a consul. Sometimes he would be upgraded to consul general. There sometimes was an honorary vice consul. So here we got a man called Bonatti Spiridione Scutari, and he was honorary vice consul because he wasn't British. But if you notice that he was there till 58, because in 58 the rules changed and only British people could be consulates. So then we start getting these kind of grand upper class names like Sidney Smith Saunders and Sir Francis Hastings Gilbert. Richard Wilkinson was actually based in Durrës in 1860. So there was a consulate there, although it didn't seem to function all of the time. And we've got these various people who took the roles. And the last one in this particular list is John Wadham Peacock. And he was private secretary to the consul. And I shall pick him up later. There's a quote that was in the Times newspaper from Richard Reed, and he was writing in the Times about his role as British consul to Albania, and this was published on the 5th of December 1871. And he says, the position of the Christian subjects of the port in this quarter is very different to what it was previous to the establishment of regular foreign consulates here, which in fact are the sole guarantees for the execution of the treaties with the port in favour of her formerly oppressed Christian subjects. So, you know, in the Victorian era, you had a number of countries who legitimately or as an excuse wanted to protect the Christians within the Ottoman Empire. So Russia, you know, used to say, we protect the Orthodox. The French would say, we protect the Catholics. And the British would say, we protect the Protestants. And so this is what he's talking about here. There were various treaties with the Ottoman Sultan that would give these different Christian communities rights. And some of the particularly French, British and Russian embassies would then try and say, we're going to protect these citizens. Although in the case of Russia, it was often an excuse for invasion. The protection was not always asked for, but there we are, that's another story. Wadham Peacock was the private secretary to the British Consul General Sir William Kirkby Green, based in Shkodra, 1878 to 1880. And he wrote a book, which is where we get this photograph from him, as there he's wearing some of the costume from northern Albania. In 1912, when Albania got independence, he put together all his notes and wrote a book called Albania, the Founding State of Europe. And this is an advertisement. This is the actual book. I've got a copy, which is where I got some of the information from. And it says, by Wadham Peacock, formerly private secretary to HBM, which is His Britannic Majesty's Chargé d'Affaires in Montenegro and Consul General in North Albania. And he had clearly travelled extensively throughout northern Albania and written about customs and costume and language and the diplomats. And you can still get copies of this secondhand. And in it is this photograph of the British consulate in Shkodra. And he was there 1878 to 1880. So I can imagine this is dated maybe about 1880. And this is what the house looked like. I have no idea if it's still there or not. I don't know. And there may well have been many buildings that look like that. We might, I'm not quite sure. You'd have to have an expert on Shkodra history to find out. But certainly there was, this is the British diplomatic presence. It was in Shkodra before it was in Durrës. There was a small British community in Shkodra, and one of the people there was a man called Lord Paget, and he built himself a little castle. So he was from a family which had their seat in Carnarvon in North Wales, and he built himself a little, I suppose a chateau you might call it, and the tower is based upon one of the towers from Carnarvon Castle, and it had a clock tower on, and this was known as Paget's Tower. It's still there today in Shkodra, and it's known as the Englishman's Clock Tower. And the British consulate then moved to this building, and in fact it was used as British presence. And then after the whole legation and British presence was concentrated in Durrës, this became a headquarters for the British Gendarmerie officers in northern Albania. So now we take the story forward, and we've got some other people who have got these roles in Shkodra, and this takes us beyond independence to 1916. So that's kind of background. Part two now is I'm going to talk about the legation in Durrës. But just so you know, the British diplomatic relations didn't start with the legation in Durrës, but they predate that. But anyway, for our purposes, we need to know that Albania got independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1912, although we should, of course, know that Albania already existed, but just not as an independent sovereign state. And obviously, Albanians have always lived there. So the 1912. Now, in 1912, when Albania was declared independence, its neighbours were Greece and Montenegro, Serbia, and the Ottoman Empire. And then nearby was Bulgaria, Romania, and then beyond that, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany, and Italy. And in those days, all of those countries were monarchies. And I guess in that context, it would seem a bit odd if Albania had been established as a republic. The only republics in Europe then were Switzerland and France. And so it was declared a monarchy and a principality, technically. And Durrës in 1913, the capital of Albania, was moved from Shkodra to Durrës. And there's an old postcard of the town. And when, this is another story, which I suggested as a possible future talk, but when a monarch was finally selected for Albania, they chose this man here, and he became Prince of Albania. In Albanian, it's Mbret. Interestingly, that is in the English dictionary, and you can use it in Scrabble. If you're ever stuck for an MB combination, you can put in Mbret. It's in the English dictionary, same reason that Kaiser and Tsar are. Anyway, he was king, or prince technically, for about 6 months. And I've this beautiful stamp of him here. You can see it says he's got Albania there in Albanian. And you would think, wouldn't you, looking at this stamp, that his name was King Frank I, wouldn't you? But that's actually the currency, 1 franc, because his name was Prince Wilhelm zu Wied. So he was a German princeling, you could say, and from one of those many principalities that made up modern Germany. And there's a whole story about him. But the relevance to us is that his royal palace, which was known as the Konak, and a Konak was just a regional administrative building within the Ottoman Empire. And here he is arriving in Durrës. And so it was in Durrës that the capital was and where the monarch lived before the Great War. And so that's where the British declared that consulate would be the main one. Although at that time we had 3 consulates in Albania, in Durrës, Vlora, and Shkodra. Anyway, at the end of 1921, the consulate at Durrës became a full legation. And we're marking 100 years of that now, but it was the same building. It was just a change of status. And it remained there. But in 1920, after the Great War, the capital of Albania was moved from Durrës to Tirana. And there's an old postcard of Tirana and a photograph that I took that afterwards I realized is a very similar view. And so you can see some bits of it are still recognizable from the 20s. And slowly, most of the foreign legations and consulates started to move to Tirana. By 1928, only the British and Italian legations remained in Durrës. All the others were in Tirana. But the British decided to stay. They liked their building. They were quite happy there, and they stayed. And so did the Italians. And from what I can tell, before the war, the British and the Italians got on very well and would be invited to each other's parties. And in fact, when some of the British, they used to have to go to Tirana for events, they would stay either with their American friends or sometimes with their Italian friends in Tirana. And this is from, up here you can see, from a letter-headed paper, British Legation, Durrës, Albania, because it was always referred to in English by the Italian name. And who did we have there? Well, I've got a list of people. Again, this may not be exhaustive, but it's a fairly thorough list. And I've got back to, well, because that building was used by British diplomats before it became the legation, I've taken it back to previous consuls. So we've got Captain Morton Frederick Eden, Harry Charles Augustus Eyes, he was consul, and then in 1922 became minister, but he was already there. And then Robert Parr became Chargé d'Affaires. William Edmund O'Reilly became minister. He was replaced by Sir William Seeds. And we know the name of one of the chancellors, Major William Frank Borman. He came in 1928 and stayed there until the very end. In fact, it's quite an interesting story because the previous chancellor was basically kicked out for fraud. And so they had to get somebody reliable in, and they brought Frank Borman in from Egypt, who was then very reliable. And he came with his wife and 2 daughters. The next minister was Robert MacLeod Hodgson. And then there was a vice consul, Major Lascelles Hadwin. And then Sir Andrew Ryan became minister. And then the last 2 came in 39, Lawrence Barton Grafty Smith, Frederick Herbert Gamble, and then the legation closed down in 1940. So here's the pictures of some of them, so you can see what they look like. So this was the man, he was the consul and then the minister. Harry Ayres, William Seeds. They're all very dapper looking men, aren't they? And this is Major Frank Borman. He got married in 1923 and had 2 daughters called Jill and Jessica. And it was in fact interviews with these ladies later in their life that gave me a lot of information about the place. He used to issue visas to Albanians visiting the UK, and he kept a diary, which one of his daughters has still got today. And he collected plants and animals, and there are specimens of his which he collected at Kew, the plants at Kew, and Tring, which is a stuffed animal branch of the Natural History Museum, which is in Hertfordshire. Robert MacLeod Hodgson became minister in 1929, and he was previously in Moscow. And when he was in Moscow, he brought some of his staff with him. He had a very trusted kavass, and he brought him with him, including his family. And then when Hodgson left, they carried on and stayed at the embassy, at the legation anyway, because they didn't want to go back to communist Russia. Lawrence Grafty Smith actually wrote some memoirs, and I'm going to quote this because it's quite interesting to show you who lived at the legation and kind of what a diverse mix of people it was. So here's a picture of Sir Robert Hodgson arriving in 1929, and can you see the official car there, which is an Armstrong Siddeley? And Lawrence Grafty Smith remembered, he said, we had a Muslim cook, a Muslim houseboy, and a Roman Catholic chauffeur. A handyman called Kol, which was Albanian shorthand for Nicholas. The Albanian secretary, Mr. Tripani Tony, had been there for many years. Our kavass was a large Russian, Porfiry Gladky, imported by Sir Ralph Hodgson when he was promoted to Albania from the consulate in Moscow. And Kol's pretty blonde wife and her sister laundered for us and did some homework. So it was like a little homework, which means like housework. And so there was a little community of people of different nationalities and different religions all living together quite happily. And there was various events when people would all get together. So they would all come to the British would come to the legation for the King's birthday and Easter. And every Easter they took a photograph of those who arrived. And I've got a number of these, and this is the best one from 1932. And in this photo, we can see members of the Borman, Hodgson, and Hadwin families, who are staff of the legation, and also some members of the British community there, plus their children. And this is taken in the courtyard of the legation building. And here's an actual invitation to a King's birthday event, which was held at the embassy. This is the invitation by Mr. Ryan, who was the minister then. In 1938, when King Zog got married, he invited all the diplomatic staff from the different legations to his wedding. And the British legation took a photograph of those attending the wedding. And so we've got this lovely photo, which enables us to see who was there in 1938. And so we've got left to right, Frank Borman, the Chancellor, Mrs. Christabel Medhurst, and we've got there Master John Ryan, then we've got Sir Andrew Ryan, Mrs. Ryan, and we've got Group Captain Charles Medhurst and Master Michael Ryan. So you can see that Mr. Ryan had his wife and 2 sons there, and Mr. Medhurst had his wife, and Frank Borman's wife and family were away in England at the time. And everyone who attended this wedding was given this badge, and this is actually Frank Borman's actual badge that he was given by King Zog for attending the wedding. Here is a painting that was made from near the legation across Durrës, and you can see how it looked there. This is in the 30s, and you can actually see King Zog's castle sitting on the hill there. And so it was a wonderful place to be, and those who lived there loved it. And they didn't really want to move to Tirana because they liked being in Durrës. And that was fine until, now this is interesting, if you compare these 2 scenes, the Italians invaded in April 1939. This is a photograph of the Italian troops arriving. And so that peace was shattered, but for many people, life carried on. And in June 1939, Britain kind of recognized the Italian occupation. The reason for that was we didn't want to rock the boat. We didn't want to give Italy an excuse to come in on the war on Hitler's side, although of course that actually happened. But in recognizing the Italian occupation, the legation was downgraded back to the consulate, which it used to be. And so it was technically a consulate of the Italian embassy in Rome. And so at that point, the minister, Andrew Ryan, left, and a new consul was appointed, who was Lawrence Grafty Smith, and he had a new vice consul, Frederick Gamble. And in August 1939, they actually moved the legation from Durrës to Tirana. This is under Italian occupation. And they were 10 months in Tirana. And here we've got Frederick Gamble. He had his own Chevrolet car, which he brought to Durrës, which was then abandoned later. And this is Lawrence Barton Grafty Smith. And if you are interested in this story, there is a picture of the book he wrote, and you can probably pick up one of those secondhand. And from there that I got some of this information. It's called Bright Levant, an autobiography. He tells our biography of his whole diplomatic career. So Albania is just one chapter within that, but it's very, very useful. On the 10th of June, 1940, Italy declared war on the United Kingdom. And as soon as they were aware of that, the members of the consulate knew that the Italians might move into the consulate. And so they burnt their papers and their ciphers so that they could not fall into enemy hands. They had papers about their friends in Albania. Albanians had been giving them information about the movements of the Italian troops, which were then passed on to Britain. And so they burnt all the ciphers so that those could not be read. And in fact, just a few hours after everything was burnt, the Italians did knock on the door. And so that was very good timing. But even in times of war, there are kind of diplomatic niceties which go on. And Italy and the UK agreed to an exchange of diplomatic personnel. And the agreement was but the British diplomats in Albania would be swapped for the Italian diplomats in Malta. And so that's what happened. And the legation staff from Albania were flown by the Italians to Malta, where they were kind of held hostage until their staff were freed. And then the Italian staff in Malta and the British staff from Albania were put on a ship, the SS Conte Rosso, which left Malta on the 13th of June 1940. They all got on very well on the ship. And then the Italians were dropped off in Italy, and then the ship carried on to Lisbon, Portugal, which was technically neutral. And then they were picked up by a British ship called the Monarch of Bermuda, which sailed into the Clyde at Glasgow. And they arrived in Glasgow on the 24th of June 1940, and then jumped on a train to London. And that was the end of the British legation in Albania before the war. The building was then abandoned, and nobody knew really what had happened until the end of the war in 1946, when a British military mission was able to go in, and they visited the British consulate to see what it was like. And in the cellar, they found scattered papers, battered silverware, trampled books, 2 dead Germans and 3 dead Albanian partisans. So there'd clearly been some kind of a shootout there, and that was the result. But British diplomatic relations were broken off as a result of the Corfu Channel incident, and were not resumed until the 90s. But that is another story, which I'm not going to go into. Instead, what I'm going to go into is my trip to find the legation. So I go to Albania from time to time. I've not been since years BC, you know, before COVID. I'd like to go back soon, but I haven't been for a while. But anyway, in 2016, I was in Durrës, and I'd actually gone for other purposes, but I thought, could I find the legation? Is it still there? I didn't know if it was still there or not. I thought probably it doesn't exist anymore, or if it does exist, maybe it's another person, maybe it doesn't look the same. And I thought, well, if it doesn't exist, what's there now? I didn't know. I just went on spec, really. And in Durrës, there's a large, down near the coast, there's a large building with a cafe on top. Have you been there, any of you? Called the Sky Tower or something like that. I don't know if you know it. I went up that tower and I sat there. I don't drink coffee, but I ordered a Coke. It was quite a hot day. And I basically looked out the building, looked from the top. So what I had to go on was some old photos and a description of the building and memories. So the people I'd interviewed remembered that I had a courtyard, had some steps going up, had a big like palm tree growing in the middle. And in the memoirs I talked about, the Grafton Smith writes, our house in Durrës was picturesque and charming. It had foaming wisteria over the gate, an old wellhead in the courtyard, and one wall of the house dated from the Venetian occupation of the 14th century. I really didn't expect to find foaming wisteria anymore, maybe not even a wellhead, but the Venetian wall was a big clue that could help. So I stood at the top of the Sky Tower, looked down, I got my camera, zoom lens, and I just looked at, there's Zog's castle. So I kind of knew, I'm looking in this kind of area really, but really didn't know what I was looking for. And then I saw a building, 2 buildings there, these 2 buildings, they kind of looked old. Maybe one of them is it, maybe. Okay. So, and as I was drinking my drink, this man came up to me, Albanian, but in fluent English. He said, can I help you? He spoke beautiful English, and we discussed which football teams we supported and all these banter. And I said, oh, what do you do? And he said, I'm a tour guide. said, great, I'm looking for the old British Legation. And he said, look down there. And he pointed it out. And this is from my photograph. So this back building here, there it is. There it is. And he told me how to find it. So I went and found it. And there it is. And there we have the gate. No wisteria, but we've got a gate. We've got a wellhead. We've got a stairway up the courtyard. And there's a plaque. Oh, there's a cat looking at me, just sitting outside. What are you doing here? And there's a plaque just there. So I went and had a look at that. And lo and behold, it's in Albanian and English. And the first sentence, 2 sentences, is a garret house built in the second half of the 19th century. In the 30s of the 20th century, it has been the seat of the English Consulate. There's confirmation. Brilliant. So we found it. And on the wall is, which is dated from the Venetian occupation, you can see this brick in there, which looks pretty Venetian to me. And there's the wellhead. Great. It's still there and it looks in really good condition. I was amazed. I really didn't expect to find it. So why has it survived? Well, it survived due to a remarkable fact that this house was the home of a famous Albanian artist called Alexander Moisiu. And the building has been restored in 1983 and is a cultural museum. And you can see there that it's open to the public. Well, when I went, I just walked in. There was nobody there at all. I just walked in. So it's open to the public. There doesn't even seem to be somebody there all the time. So if you're in Durrës, you can go visit it, which is just brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I was chuffed to bits with that. And I'm wondering now if somehow, if only we had somebody in Durrës, eh? It would be wonderful if we could get a plaque on the house to tell the story of it being the British Legation building and put some dates on it and maybe unveil it by the British ambassador or something. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing to do for this year of the centenary of bilateral relations? Anyway, that's the end of my presentation, and I'm very happy to answer some questions.